My interest in trams started in April of 1939. For years I'd gone with my family, we lived at Erdington in Birmingham, through to Wednesbury. The travel used to be on the tram into the centre of Birmingham, and then I'd catch another tram, a 75, from Snow Hill. And then one day I found, when we got to the centre of Birmingham, that instead of the 75 tram, there was simply a bus. And I said, well, why is there this bus? And my parents said, oh, well, they've withdrawn the trams. And I said, well, why? I said, well, trams are out of date, they're disappearing. And this news that the trams were disappearing caused me to feel, well, I must keep an interest in these things. In fact, I must do all I can to try and keep these trams. Given the terrible years when the tram was disappearing fast from this country, we could see that if our hobby was to be preserved at all, probably the only way we could do it was to try and preserve some trams ourselves. We started off in a very modest way. It was in 1948. We saw at the back end of one of the depots there was an open top tram, and we said, well, can't we have that out? And without standing on ceremony, they said yes. So this tram was taken out and went around the system, and we all enjoyed it. And when it was over, the question was, well, what's going to happen to that? And I said, well, that's its last journey, it'll be scrapped now. And this rather touched the participants of the tour, as a result of which, on the train back to London, they discussed it and decided, well, could we not buy it?
The collection now stands at over 60 trams, taken from locations across the UK and the world.
And so we were looking around to try and find where we could have a site that would meet our purposes. And finally, in 1959, the site at Crouch in Derbyshire became available.
I saw the first tram to arrive in Crouch at 7 o'clock in the morning. I was out taking photographs with my camera. There were 2 or 3 trams came in, and they were all covered in polythene.
The only reason this site was considered in the first place as a museum is because we were seeking a home for one of the Sheffield trams.
And of course it was pretty depressing, first of all because it was pretty bleak, as it still is, but particularly of course in January there were no services whatsoever. There was one cold water tap.
It was a bit of a place when he came. There were none of the buildings to talk of. I think there was a tram shed and everything was covered and, nothing had been done.
So we you really had to be imaginative to think, well, was there a possibility? But I came to the conclusion there probably was something.
And like everybody else at that time, we either came ourselves by public transport or we begged a lift, and we did whatever was necessary, from digging to concreting to anything that was required.
The Claycross Company was the owner of the land. That was the company that George Stevenson himself had set up, and so we negotiated with them, and they offered us a lease for 3 years, renewable, at renewable once, so 6 years maximum, at a stupendous rent of £75.
So of course if we wanted to dig holes for poles to put the traction poles in, we had to dig a hole and deep enough to contain the pole and hold it up straight with all the weight of the wires on. And we found that, I forget what percentage it was, but there was a percentage of the holes that we dug where literally a couple of feet down you got solid rock, and there was nothing for it but to blast the hole. And we had a tame gentleman locally who very kindly came with a stick of dynamite and blew the holes for us.
Within 12 months we were negotiating to get the freehold, and one of our members offered us a loan of £1,000 for that purpose. So we went to the Claycross Company again and said, "Were you prepared to sell the freehold for £1,000?" And they went along with that idea. And then gradually we acquired more and more property until we've got now 45 acres here, both sides of the road.
The Derby Assembly Rooms was burnt down in Derby many years ago, and they were left with the facade, the frontage of it. So we said to them, OK, if you want to bring it to Cryche at your expense and pay all the expenses, we'll have it here.
And yes, we watched them sort of bring that big building at front at Warrington Field, and we wondered what they were on with, you know. And
in due course, in 1974, the facade was put up here, and that was really what threw the village. They thought, well, what on earth is happening? We thought, you know, if they kept it low scale, not so bad, but this huge building going up, towering over the place.
And of course that triggered off, when it appeared in the local press, it triggered off the usual cries of distress.
So we had a meeting here again in dreadful weather, in which we finally, I think, allayed the fears of the village, and I think we learned a lesson there to have a lot more rapport with the village.
As a sweetener, all the villagers were given a free ticket. And then when it was congested, you see, and you couldn't actually get out of the village. I can remember it was so busy that the old village was gridlocked.
When I first lived here, and we used to have the extravaganzas each year. Hot air balloons came, and the Red Arrows, and it brought thousands in. We couldn't get out the village in those days. We used to get blocked in the avenue where I live.
Well, we are looking at all the trams and we're taking videos
and
pictures of things, and we're going to put the trams and we're going to put them into like a little video. What I like about the museum is that there's a lot of different trams that you can ride on, and there's a woods that you can run round in, and there's lots of different trams to look at. And here's the film we shot. Part of the tramway village is riding on a tram because it's very fun. What I've enjoyed about today is getting some sweets from Alan. My favourite part was going on the tram.
And he said to me, Mum, one day, would you like to get shut of your car for a day a week? You know. She says, oh, I'd love to. He says, can he make tea? She says, oh, he knows how to make tea. I says, let him come to my workshop and he can make me tea and I'll have him for a day a week for you. He'd been a signwriter and it was his own business, you know, and he'd done it all his life, signwriting. But I could see what he was doing in signwriting. It wasn't right to me. So I looked straight in his face and I says, you're rubbish. Because I says, you're not doing it right. And so he had a bit of a temper with him. And in his temper, he got a paintbrush in one hand and a pot of paint in the other. He says, get on with it, knowing that I wouldn't be able to do it, I suppose. So I took the paint pot and the brush off him. I put right what he'd done wrong, finished his sign off, and he couldn't believe it, in a couple of hours. He says, my God, you've done half of tomorrow's work there.
We had a teacher at school, Mr. Morris, who was actually joint area organiser for an organisation called the Light Railway Transport League in Birmingham with a chap called Geoffrey Claydon, who is one of our legal advisors here, one of the founder members. It started basically, I'd written a little composition at school and Mr. Morris, who I wasn't in his class, said, can I look at that? Read it and said, have you heard of the Tramway Museum? The rest is history. The first time I actually came to work here, it was the end of 1967, and then in 1968 came here on a regular basis, and I've never been away since.
There was a Derby tram here, and it was in a terrible state, but I asked if it could be if I could do it, paint it. I wasn't bothered about mechanics because I don't know anything about mechanics, and eventually they let me do it.
I always knew of the existence of the Tram Museum, being I always lived in Crouch, and this job was advertised as for an electrical fitter, and I thought, well, I'm probably too old now for him to be interested in setting me on, but I applied, and I started here in 2004, January 2004, and I didn't know what to expect, and I must admit that I do like the job.
We started with just one employee and then we gradually built up from that, and we've now got at times over 30 employees here. It's seasonal, of course, for some, particularly in the shops and the cafes and that, but we have a very loyal workforce there, and so now a great deal, of course, of the burden of running the place rests with those employees more than the volunteers. But ultimately it's the volunteers that control the outfit.
It's the best job I've ever had in my life, and I sincerely mean that, because you're doing something completely different and not every day is the same.
So I've asked if I can stay on for 3 days instead of 5, so I'll still get 4 days a week off. And hopefully that's acceptable.
The future, I think we'll just have to wait and see. But there again, it could be very, very interesting. What we are here for are these tramcars and these tramcars, and this is a unique collection within the world. I think we're looked on a basis that we're a benchmark for other museums around the world.